The clatter of cutlery, the low murmur of conversation, the familiar scent of steak and cigar smoke. March 12, 1954, at Small's Paradise began like countless other evenings for Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was in his element, holding court in the heart of his Harlem kingdom. And beside him, as he had been for 8 years, was Raymond Quick Lewis. Their ritual was so ingrained it was almost invisible, a piece of living protocol. Before Bumpy would touch a single morsel placed before him, Quick would sample it. A bite of the steak, a sip of the drink. It was a simple, ancient practice, a human safeguard in a world where power was the ultimate target and dinner could be a weapon. On this night, that protocol ceased to be routine and became, in a matter of heartbeats, the definitive act of a man's life. For nearly a decade, this act had been a blend of duty and trust. It was a practical measure, certainly. Bumpy had made enemies in high and low places, from uptown rivals to downtown mafia dons eyeing his lucrative Harlem numbers racket. But it was also a symbol, a daily reaffirmation of the bond between the king and his most trusted shield. Quick wasn't just tasting for poison. He was participating in a ceremony of security. He was the first line of defense, the human censor who turned the abstract threat of betrayal into a tangible, manageable ritual. In those moments, Bumpy's life was literally in Quick's hands, and in return, Bumpy placed in him a faith that was worth more than any salary. This was the unspoken contract of their world, loyalty offered and loyalty returned, creating a fortress of mutual dependence. But on that March evening, the ritual's meaning was about to be violently rewritten. When the plate was set down, a steak presumably ordered, cooked, and served through a chain of hands that had been compromised, Quick performed his part. He took a bite. And then, the world shattered. The transition from normalcy to nightmare was not a slow fade, it was a physical detonation. Within seconds, the familiar surroundings of Small's Paradise twisted into a scene of grotesque horror. The convulsions began, a violent rebellion of the body against an unseen internal attacker. Foam, white and terrible, gathered at his mouth, a visceral sign of a nervous system under catastrophic assault. The poison, a vicious cocktail of arsenic and cyanide engineered by Vito Genovese's people, was not subtle. It was a weapon of terror, designed to kill with speed and spectacle, to send a message as unmistakable as it was brutal. In those agonizing seconds, as the poison seared through him, Raymond Lewis possessed a terrible clarity. The immediate savage reaction of his own body was the answer to the unasked question. This was no case of tainted meat or a kitchen accident. This was the hit. The long-dreaded, meticulously planned attempt on Bumpy Johnson's life had arrived, and it had arrived on a dinner plate. He had intercepted it. The knowledge must have been instant and absolute. The poison was meant for Bumpy. And in that final, conscious moment, Lewis made a choice. He could have spat it out, cried a warning, perhaps bought himself a chance at survival with immediate medical aid. But he did not. He swallowed. That act, the deliberate consumption of a known agonizing death, transcended all protocol. It transformed duty into sacrifice. It was no longer a bodyguard performing a job. It was a man consciously trading his future for his bosses. The motivation in that choice is the core of the entire saga. It was likely not a calculated decision made with cold logic, but a reflexive eruption of a deeper code. It was the ultimate fulfillment of the promise implicit in his role. In his world, your word and your loyalty were the only currencies that never depreciated. To fail in that moment would have been to live with a dishonor worse than death. By taking the poison fully into himself, he was doing more than saving Bumpy's physical life. He was preserving the entire ethos they operated under. He was proving that some bonds were unbreakable, even by cyanide. His death was not a passive event, it was an active, devastating gift. As he collapsed, the message was delivered with more eloquence than any speech. Bumpy, witnessing the horrific result of his own would-be murder, was not just saved, he was indebted. He was wounded in a way no bullet could achieve. The debt was no longer professional, it was profoundly, unbearably personal. A man had looked death in the face, recognized it as Bumpy's, and said, "Take me instead." This created an obligation that went beyond the standard rules of gangland revenge, which demanded an eye for an eye. This demanded a soul for a soul. The weight of that sacrifice immediately reshaped Bumpy Johnson's world. Grief was there, certainly, a sharp, personal loss for a trusted companion, but it was quickly forged in the furnace of a furious guilt and a towering obligation. Quick's death became the central defining fact of Bumpy's next chapter. The coming war with Genovese would not merely be about territory or respect or business. It would be a sacred mission to balance the moral scales. Raymond Quick Lewis, in his final agonizing moments, had done more than protect Bumpy's body. He had shackled Bumpy's conscience and destiny to a single, overwhelming purpose: to honor that sacrifice with a perfect mirror justice. The routine had become the legendary, and a Harlem king was now a vow-bound avenger, his every subsequent move fueled by the memory of a man who ate death in his stead. The sizzle of the steak on the plate at Small's Paradise that night was the sound of a conspiracy reaching its climax. This was no impulsive act of violence, no spur-of-the-moment hit by a rival crew. The poisoning of Bumpy Johnson's dinner was a meticulously calibrated act of corporate warfare, emanating from the highest echelons of organized crime. It bore the cold, clinical signature of Vito Genovese, a man whose ambition was as vast as his cruelty, and crucially, it operated under a veil of legitimacy provided by the very government of the underworld, the Mafia Commission. To understand the depth of the betrayal, one must first understand Vito Genovese. By 1954, Don Vito was a man consumed by a singular vision: the consolidation of absolute power. Having returned from a self-imposed exile in Italy after World War II, he was methodically clawing his way to the top of the American Mafia, eliminating rivals and consolidating factions. Harlem, with its immensely profitable numbers racket, often called the poor man's stock market, represented a glittering prize, while the Italian mob had long taken a slice of the proceeds through uneasy alliances and street-level partnerships. Genovese viewed this as inelegant and insufficient. He didn't want a percentage, he wanted the deed, and standing in the way of a clean, total takeover was one formidable, uncooperative black man, Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy was not a subordinate, he was a sovereign power in his own territory, a partner who could become a problem. For Genovese's vision of a streamlined, wholly controlled empire, such a figure was an unacceptable anomaly. Thus, the decision was made not for street-level dominance, but for strategic eradication. The method chosen, poison, was itself a statement. It was not the intimate violence of a garrote, or the public drama of a shooting. Poison is a coward's weapon, but also a strategist's. It requires planning, insider access, and a chilling detachment. The cocktail of arsenic and cyanide was particularly sadistic in its design. Arsenic, a classic painful agent that disrupts cellular function, causing vomiting and cramping. Cyanide, the dramatic killer, which blocks the body's ability to use oxygen, leading to convulsions and suffocation. Together, they created a symphony of agony, ensuring death was both certain and spectacular. This was terror as policy. It sent a message that was meant to resonate far beyond Harlem, cross the Genovese family, and you would die not in a blaze of glory, but in a private, humiliating convulsion, betrayed by the very sustenance of life. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the plot was its institutional sanction. The Mafia Commission, formed in 1931 to end the bloody Castellammarese War and regulate criminal enterprise, functioned as the board of directors for the American La Cosa Nostra. Composed of the bosses of the 5 families and other powerful entities, its purpose was to mediate disputes, approve new members, and, critically, authorize murders of made men or significant figures that could spark wider wars. For Genovese to move against a figure of Bumpy's stature, a non-Italian but a hugely powerful criminal entity whose death would undoubtedly cause massive upheaval, he would have needed, at the very least, the Commission's tacit approval. This approval, whether given through a formal sit-down or a series of understood nods, transformed the hit from a personal power grab into a sanctioned corporate action. It meant the other families, the Gambinos, the Luccheses, the Bonanos, the Colombos, were aware and would stand aside. It legitimized the invasion of Harlem in their eyes. Bumpy wasn't just facing Vito Genovese, he was facing the collective will and cold calculus of the Commission, which had decided that the stability of their agreements and the potential of Genovese's expanded revenue stream outweighed the risk of Bumpy's retaliation. They viewed Harlem not as a sovereign kingdom, but as a subsidiary ripe for a hostile takeover. In giving their blessing, they stripped Bumpy of any potential allies within the Italian mob and framed his impending murder as a business necessity, a tidying up of the organizational chart. This context makes Raymond Quick Lewis's sacrifice and Bumpy's ensuing war not just a personal conflict, but a revolutionary one. When Bumpy mobilized after Lewis's death, he wasn't merely retaliating against a rival gang. He was declaring war on the Commission itself. His 48-hour blitz, the systematic targeting of Genovese bookies, enforcers, and warehouses, was a direct assault on the assets of a Commission-sanctioned operation. Every strike was a defiance of their authority, a statement that their laws and their approvals meant nothing on his streets. He was, in essence, an independent nation refusing an annexation order from a superpower alliance. The Genovese hit, therefore, was a perfect storm of cold ambition and institutional arrogance. It was Genovese's ruthless drive for expansion, enabled by the Commission's clinical detachment and their underestimation of Bumpy Johnson as a strategic mind and a force of will. They had planned for a death, not a martyrdom. They had anticipated a vacuum, not a volcano. They failed to account for the human element, the loyalty that could turn a bodyguard into a sacrificial lamb, and the debt that could turn a calculated kingpin into a single-minded force of vengeance. The poison on the plate was the embodiment of the mob's corporate evil, but the man who ate it, and the man who avenged him, proved that even the most carefully laid plans of a commission could shatter against the harder stone of personal honor and ruthless, loving retribution. The death of Raymond Lewis settled upon Bumpy Johnson not as a wave of grief, but as a forge of purpose. In the stunned, horrified silence that followed the convulsions, the foam, the final stillness in the corner of Small's paradise, a new Bumpy was being hammered into existence. This was not the strategic businessman, the savvy negotiator who had parlayed with Lucky Luciano, nor was it the fearsome street general who commanded Harlem's corners. This was something more primal, more ancient. Vengeance was a given. In their world, a killing demanded a killing. But what took shape in Bumpy's mind in those first hours was not mere vengeance. It was a vow of perfect, ritualistic justice. Vito Genovese would not simply die. He would die in the exact same manner, by poison. This singular demand became the scripture of his grief, the non-negotiable creed of the coming war. To understand the weight of this vow, one must move beyond the economy of the street hit. A bullet from a passing car, a stabbing in a dark alley, a beating in a warehouse, these were the currencies of power struggles. They were transactional, if brutal, tools. They sent a message of dominance, of removal. But poison was different. Poison was intimate, deceitful, and cowardly. It violated a fundamental, if unspoken, code of their violent world. The chance, however slim, to face your enemy. It turned a meal, a moment of sustenance and community, into a weapon. It was a betrayal of basic human trust, weaponizing the mundane. For Genovese to use poison was to declare that no rules, not even the brutal ones of their own universe, applied. He had reached into Bumpy's private life, into a moment of presumed safety, and corrupted it utterly. By vowing to return the favor in kind, Bumpy was doing far more than planning a murder. He was insisting on a restoration of moral symmetry. He was asserting that the universe, or at least his corner of it, had to be rebalanced. The scales had been tipped not just by a death, but by the manner of the death. Therefore, the counterweight had to be the same shape. It wasn't enough for Genovese to pay, he had to understand his payment. He had to experience the same creeping horror, the same betrayal of his own body, the same terrifying realization that something meant to give life was instead delivering an agonizing end. Bumpy's demand for poison was a demand for empathy, forced through identical suffering. He wanted Genovese to know, in his final seconds, precisely what Raymond Lewis had known, and to know that it was Bumpy who had served him the plate. This vow immediately elevated the conflict from a territorial battle to a sacred, personal crusade. Every action Bumpy took in the explosive 48 hours that followed, the lightning strikes on Genovese's operations, the dismantling of his street crews, was not the end goal. It was groundwork. It was attrition. It was the act of stripping Genovese of his armor, his soldiers, his sense of security, to isolate the man himself for the final, destined act. The street war had a tactical purpose, to cripple Genovese's Harlem ambitions and demonstrate Bumpy's undiminished power. But its spiritual purpose was to create the conditions for the vow's fulfillment. It was a prelude to a specific poetic death. This pursuit of mirrored fate became Bumpy's obsession, a guiding star that shone with a cold, relentless light. It influenced his strategy, making it more focused and more dangerous. He wasn't just seeking to win, he was seeking to capture a particular kind of victory. It is said he even sought out chemists, exploring the grim logistics of his promise. The vow also became a psychological burden for Genovese, or at least it was meant to. The message was deliberately sent: "You tried to poison me. Now I am coming to poison you." It transformed Genovese from a distant, scheming executive into a potential victim in his own story. Every meal, every drink poured by a new face, every gesture of hospitality now carried a seed of potential dread. Bumpy weaponized anticipation. Yet the stark, tragic truth that gives this vow its profound resonance is that it was ultimately unfulfilled in its exact terms. Vito Genovese would die in 1969, not in a Harlem restaurant or a mob social club with foam on his lips, but in a federal prison medical center. His downfall came from the law, from a drug conviction, from the betrayals of underlings like Joe Valachi. This fact is not an anticlimax, but rather the key to understanding the vow's true power. For Bumpy, the vow was never just a tactical plan, it was a moral compass. It was the measure of his debt to Raymond Lewis. The fact that he could not, in the end, force the universe to comply with his demanded symmetry did not diminish the vow's importance. It may have even intensified it, because the unfulfilled promise to kill Genovese with poison meant that Bumpy's debt to Quick could only be paid in other ways. The energy of that vow, frustrated in one direction, was channeled completely into another, the care of Raymond Lewis's family. If he could not balance the scales with Genovese's death, he would balance them with Lewis's legacy. The vow for poison was absolute and singular, and its impossibility meant his other promise, to protect Quick's kin, had to become equally absolute and infinitely sustainable. Thus, the poetic justice he craved for his enemy was transformed into a permanent, generative justice for his friend. The vow became a covenant, and its target shifted from destroying a life to sustaining lives. In the end, the promise of poison defined Bumpy's war, but its metamorphosis defined his honor. It proved that the most powerful force born from that night at Small's Paradise was not a plot for a perfect murder, but the enduring weight of a perfect debt. The stillness in Small's Paradise, after Raymond Lewis's body was carried out, was not a silence of shock, but a silence of gathering storm. Bumpy Johnson, standing amidst the wreckage of a ritual and the corpse of his most loyal man, did not weep and did not roar. He calculated. The grief was a white-hot ingot in his chest, but he immediately began forging it into a weapon. The 48 hours that followed were not a spontaneous eruption of rage, they were a masterclass in compressed, surgical urban warfare, a declaration that Harlem was not a territory to be annexed by committee, but a sovereign nation with a commander-in-chief who had just been personally attacked. This was the Harlem War, swift, brutal, and designed to send a single, unambiguous message back downtown. The Commission's sanction was a piece of paper, and Bumpy Johnson was a fire. He moved first not with bullets, but with information. His network, a vast, intricate web of numbers runners, taxi drivers, bartenders, street corner lookouts, and even beat cops whose palms he greased, hummed to life. This was Bumpy's true genius. He was not just a gangster, he was the central nervous system of Harlem. Within an hour, he knew which Genovese crew had been given the contract, which associates had been scouting Smalls, and, critically, which local figures had been compromised to allow the poison through the kitchen. The retaliation was not a blind lashing out. It was a series of precise, devastating strikes on the infrastructure of Genovese's fledgling Harlem Incu. The first targets were the visible symbols, the bookmaking operations. These weren't hidden back rooms. They were the storefronts of the invasion, where Genovese's soldiers were trying to siphon the lifeblood of the numbers game. Bumpy's crews hit them not with stealth, but with terrifying spectacle. Locations were not just robbed, they were dismantled, phones ripped from walls, betting slips set ablaze in the street, furniture shattered. The messengers and collectors, often tough guys from downtown who thought Harlem would be an easy score, were intercepted. Some were given a beating so severe it served as a living warning, others simply vanished, their fate a whispered lesson. The message was operational. Your apparatus here is now scrap metal and fear. Next came the enforcers, the muscle Genovese had imported to project strength and protect his new assets. Bumpy understood that to break an occupation, you must break the morale of the occupying army. Isolated soldiers were cornered in bars, on side streets, in their borrowed apartments. The violence was personal and terrifying. It was said that Bumpy's men, many of whom had known and respected Quick Lewis, carried a particular fury. These weren't just business disputes, they were acts of homage. A Genovese tough guy found in an alley with broken knees wasn't just a casualty, he was a receipt. Proof that Bumpy's debt was being collected in flesh and bone. The goal was to make Harlem an unsustainable posting, to make very Italian face on the street feel like a target, to transform perceived power into palpable vulnerability. Perhaps the most strategically brilliant move was the targeting of warehouses and distribution points. Genovese wasn't just after numbers, he was using Harlem as a hub for narcotics, stolen goods, and alcohol. Bumpy's intelligence identified these logistical nodes. Trucks were hijacked and their contents scattered across the neighborhood as a perverse form of charity. Warehouses, supposedly secret, were engulfed in flames that lit up the Harlem night, visible for miles. These were economic hits, aimed at the balance sheet. They told Genovese, and more importantly the Commission, that Bumpy could inflict not just bodily harm, but serious financial pain. He was burning their investment to the ground. This 48-hour blitz created a state of shock within the Genovese family and its allies. The sheer velocity of the response was disorienting. They had expected a power vacuum, or at best, a period of chaotic grief, followed by negotiations from a weakened position. Instead, they received a coordinated military campaign from a commander who operated with total deniability and local anonymity. Bumpy was a ghost in his own kingdom, issuing orders through layers of insulation, his presence felt everywhere but seen nowhere. The commission's approval meant nothing to the street-level reality of ambushed bookies and burning trucks. Their corporate takeover had met a grassroots ensue. Argency, led by a man who knew every brick and alley of the battlefield. The war also solidified Bumpy's mythic status in Harlem. While the common citizens saw only the surface tremors, the heightened tension, the whispered news of downtown guys getting their comeuppance, the underlying truth resonated. Bumpy was fighting for Harlem's autonomy. This wasn't just a gang war, it was a resistance. His ruthless efficiency in defending his turf, sparked by a personal betrayal, translated into a form of perverse civic pride. He was proving that the neighborhood would not be easily colonized, that it had its own sovereign power. In defending his throne, he was, in a way, defending their home. When the dust settled after 2 days, a new equilibrium, brittle and charged, had been established. The Genovese advance into Harlem wasn't just halted, it was rolled back, its forward elements shattered, its collaborators terrified into silence or elimination. Bumpy had done more than avenge Raymond Lewis in those 48 hours, he had re-established the price of entry. He had demonstrated that his power was not derivative, not loaned by the commission, but organic, brutal and total. The war was a statement written in fire and blood. Harlem had a king, and the king's word, forged in the poison that killed his friend, was the only law that mattered on those streets. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been clarified through a storm of violence, leaving no doubt about who truly controlled the kingdom. In the end, the most meticulously planned vengeance can be thwarted by the chaotic currents of fate. Bumpy Johnson's sacred vow, his promise to serve Vito Genovese a death identical to Raymond Lewis's, would never find its perfect poetic fulfillment. Genovese died in 1969, not on his knees in a posh restaurant, but in a medical center at the United States Penitentiary in Springfield, Missouri. His heart, not cyanide, gave out. He was brought down not by a rival's poison, but by the betrayals of his own men and the relentless machinery of federal law. For a storyteller seeking symmetry, this might feel like an unsatisfying conclusion. But for understanding the true legacy of that night at Small's Paradise, it is the essential, transformative truth. The unfulfilled promise of a poisoned enemy became the furnace that forged an eternal living promise to a fallen friend. Bumpy's ultimate victory was not in how Genovese died, but in how Raymond Lewis's family lived. The debt Bumpy carried was not a financial one, to be settled in a single transaction. It was a moral, soul-crushing weight. Quick had offered the ultimate gift, a future exchange for Bumpy's. The only currency valuable enough to even begin repaying such a debt was the future itself. Not Bumpy's, but the future of the man who had forfeited his. So, in the aftermath of the war, the fury and the grim acceptance that Genovese might escape his specific brand of justice, Bumpy's focus underwent a profound and permanent shift. The energy that had fueled his crusade for retribution was now channeled, wholly and without reservation, into a crusade of provision and protection. He made a deathbed promise to Raymond, but then spent the rest of his own life ensuring that promise would outlast him, becoming a multi-generational covenant. This covenant was practical, tangible, and absolute. The Lewis family was moved from the periphery of his world to its very center. They were placed under what those in his life called the umbrella. This was not a metaphor. It meant financial security so complete it was invisible. Rent, mortgages, bills, these concerns simply vanished. Children's educations, from private school tuitions to college funds, were not just covered but guaranteed. If a car broke down, a new one appeared. If a job was needed, a respectable, legitimate position was found through one of Bumpy's countless connections in the legal business world. The support was not a handout, it was an endowment, delivered with such discretion and consistency that it became a fact of life, as reliable as sunrise. It was Bumpy's way of weaving Raymond's sacrifice directly into the fabric of his family's destiny, ensuring that the father's death yielded, not deprivation, but opportunity. But the protection went far beyond finances. In a world riddled with predators and opportunists, the Lewis name became inviolable. Words circulated on the streets and in the back rooms, that is Quick Lewis's family. They are Bumpy's people. It was a shield more potent than any bodyguard. To even look at them with ill intent was to invite a wrath that had already once brought the Mafia Commission's designs to a bloody halt. This security granted them a rare gift in their environment, normalcy. They could live, work, and dream without the ambient fear that shadowed so many connected to the life. Bumpy had absorbed that fear on their behalf, standing as a permanent bulwark between them and the repercussions of the world he and Raymond had inhabited. Most importantly, Bumpy institutionalized this debt. He understood his own mortality. He knew that empires of the street are fleeting, that power dissipates. So he made the care of the Lewis family a pillar of his own legacy, instructing his most trusted lieutenants, and later his wife May, that this duty was non-negotiable, transcending any shifts in business or alliances. It was to be a standing order, as permanent as the organization itself. He transformed a personal vow into a perpetual trust fund of safety and respect. In doing so, he redefined what honor meant in a dishonorable business. It was no longer just about courage in a fight or silence under interrogation. It was about the unwavering stewardship of a sacrifice across decades. This is the powerful, subversive end to the story of poison and war. The narrative begins with the coldest, most corporate form of betrayal, a sanctioned poisoning, and ends with the warmest, most personal form of fidelity, a lifelong generative loyalty. Bumpy Johnson, the legendary Godfather of Harlem, ultimately secured his place in history, not through the enemy he couldn't kill in the way he wanted, but through the family he saved, elevated, and enshrined. The story of the Italian mob's poison is a story of transactional violence. The story of Bumpy's promise is one of transformational debt. Raymond Quick Lewis's final act was one of consummate loyalty. Bumpy Johnson's answer was to build a monument to that loyalty not in stone, but in time. In the futures he secured, the generations he shielded, the enduring safety he crafted from his own relentless sense of obligation. In the end, the promise kept was far more powerful than the revenge imagined. It proved that in the brutal calculus of the underworld, some equations are never closed, some debts are forever, and the most lasting power isn't found in the ability to destroy, but in the unwavering will to protect. The poison was meant to end a legacy. Instead, it birthed one that would live on, safely and soundly, long after everyone involved had passed from the scene.